What happened when an undercover CEO posed as a janitor in his own senior care facility will leave you speechless. To all our thoughtful, compassionate listeners, you're the kind of people who believe in second chances, quiet strength, and doing what's right even when it's hard. Today's story is about a forgotten promise, a struggling single mom, and a man who finally remembered what truly matters. Get ready for a journey of redemption, dignity, and hope, because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin in the most unexpected places. Let's dive into the story of Rose's Table and the CEO who came home. The ocean breeze swept softly across the Oregon coastline as Rose Whitaker sat beside her brother Graham on a weathered driftwood log. It was a chilly fall evening, their shared thermos of black coffee warming their hands as the sky turned copper and gold. Rose had always been the dreamer between them, the one who saw dignity in the smallest acts, like a warm meal or a clean table. That night she spoke of a new idea, a community program within their elder care company, one that would quietly feed struggling families of caregivers, no questions asked. It's not charity, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. It's nourishment. For the body and for the soul. Graham, ever the numbers man, chuckled at her idealism, but nodded. I'll back it, he promised. We'll call it Rose's Table. Years passed, the program launched, and then, too quickly, Rose was gone, taken by an aggressive cancer that left Graham hollow and buried in boardrooms. Somewhere along the line, the program faded, overtaken by budgets and branding. Now, sitting alone in his penthouse office years later, Graham watched the latest PR scandal unfold on screen, a video of one of his staff mistreating a homeless veteran on facility grounds. Outrage spread like wildfire. Stock prices dipped, headlines screamed hypocrisy, but beneath the noise, Graham felt something deeper, a tug, a memory. That night on the beach, her voice, the promise. Without telling anyone, Graham took a leave of absence and slipped into the back door of Seaside Horizons under a new name, Gary. Dressed in a janitor's uniform and armed only with mop, bucket, and anonymity, he was no longer CEO, just a man on a mission to find out what they had lost and whether any of Rose's light remained. Graham, now going by Gary, settled into the night shift at Seaside Horizons with little fanfare. The uniform was stiff, the fluorescent lights harsh, and the silence of the long tiled hallways both calming and unsettling. Most of the night staff barely noticed the new janitor beyond the occasional nod or request to mop a spill. But one person stood out to him almost immediately. Miranda Chen. She moved through her tasks with quiet precision, her eyes constantly scanning, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were always bracing for bad news. She didn't speak much, kept her head down, and never lingered in the break room with the others. But what caught Graham's attention most wasn't her silence. It was her routine. Around 2 a.m., when the halls emptied and the last rounds were done, Miranda would slip into the staff kitchen. There, under the hum of the aging refrigerator, she'd quietly collect uneaten food from patient trays, still covered rolls, untouched apple slices, sealed yogurts, and carefully tuck them into plastic containers she brought from home. At first, Graham assumed she was just hungry, but her behavior told a different story. She never ate on site. Instead, she packed methodically and then disappeared into the night with her tote bag close to her side. Rumors floated around the staff that Miranda had been demoted, that she was taking leftovers home against policy, that she was a charity case who hadn't quite bounced back. No one seemed to know the full story, and no one seemed to care. But Graham did. There was something in the way she moved that felt familiar, a quiet dignity that reminded him of someone he'd lost. While the others rolled their eyes or looked the other way, Graham watched. He took mental notes, swept floors within earshot, and listened. And as the puzzle of Miranda Chen began to form piece by quiet piece, he realized she wasn't just a janitor sneaking food. She was surviving in a system that no longer saw her. Just like the program Rose had built for people like her. Just like the promise Graham had forgotten. Back in his modest rental apartment a few miles from Seaside Horizons, Graham couldn't sleep. The sounds of the night, distant waves, an occasional honking car, did little to quiet the churn in his mind. He sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee untouched in his hands, staring at an old photo of him and Rose. It had been taken during the grand opening of Seaside's first facility, Rose in her nurse's scrubs beaming with pride, and Graham in a suit, smiling stiffly, already preoccupied with expansion plans. The photo felt like a relic from a different life. He reached for his laptop, pulling up archived files from the company's original community initiatives. After some digging, he found the digital folder labeled Rose's Table Nourishment Program. Inside were old memos, emails, even scanned notes in Rose's handwriting. A file titled Long-Term Support Cases caught his eye. The list was short, only a few names, but one jumped out at him: Miranda Chen. Graham stared at it, stunned. He remembered the name vaguely from a donor dinner Rose had hosted, one where she spoke passionately about caregivers who worked themselves to the bone and still went home hungry. "They don't wear signs," she'd said, "but they carry invisible weight." Graham realized with growing discomfort that the woman quietly packing leftovers every night wasn't just a struggling employee. She was someone his sister had chosen to protect. And now, years later, that protection had quietly eroded under his watch. His signature was on a document authorizing the phase-out of Rose's program. He had signed it without a second glance, lost in grief and quarterly reports. The thought settled on him like a stone. The shame, the neglect. It was personal now. Miranda wasn't just an anonymous janitor. She was Rose's unfinished story, and maybe his only chance to finish it right. After another long night shift, Graham, still in disguise as Gary, followed Miranda from a distance as she left the facility just past 6:30 a.m. She didn't drive. Instead, she walked with determined steps through the early morning fog to a cracked sidewalk bus stop on the edge of town. She paused, only to adjust the tote bag slung over her shoulder, the same one he'd seen her fill with food. Within minutes, 3 children appeared from a nearby side street, their backpacks slapping against their backs as they ran to greet her. The youngest, a boy around 8, beamed up at her. Ely, Graham guessed. 2 others followed closely, a lanky teen girl with her hood up and a tired posture, and a quiet boy who kept his head down, shuffling his feet. Miranda smiled and greeted them softly, crouching down to unzip her bag. One by one, she handed out small bundles wrapped in paper napkins. Half a sandwich here, apple slices there, a wrapped roll and sealed yogurt. The kids unwrapped their makeshift breakfast like it was routine, eating quickly but gratefully. Graham stayed hidden in his parked car across the street, heart tight in his chest. This wasn't a woman stealing scraps. This was a mother trying to feed her family, quietly, shamefully, and without complaint. There was no waste, no indulgence. Every bite was eaten, every moment was handled with care. When the bus arrived, the 4 boarded together. Graham followed in his car, trailing them through neighborhoods more worn than he remembered, graffiti-tagged fences, sagging rooftops, and shuttered storefronts. Eventually, they got off near a tired-looking apartment complex, the kind built in the 70s and forgotten soon after. From the window of his sedan, Graham watched Miranda usher the kids up the cracked stairs and through a metal security gate. He didn't need to see more to understand what was happening. She was raising not just her son, but likely her late sister's children, too. No help, no public recognition. Just sheer will. He thought of Rose again, how she used to say the people who struggled the most were often the quietest about it. As Graham sat there in the morning light, the truth settled on him with crushing weight. Somewhere between board meetings and PR dinners, he had stopped looking. But Miranda? She had never stopped surviving. And now he couldn't unsee her. Back at corporate headquarters, Graham stepped into his old office, a space that now felt more like a stranger's domain than his own. The polished floors, the sleek decor, the artful silence, it all seemed sterile compared to the rawness he'd witnessed outside. He slid behind his desk and opened the locked drawer where he'd kept old personal files from Rose's early programs. It took only a few minutes to find what he was looking for, a yellowing folder labeled Rose Nourish Initiative. Inside were early drafts, community partner agreements, handwritten notes in Rose's looping cursive. Graham read her words slowly, reverently. Don't just serve food, serve dignity. He swallowed, the knot rising in his throat. Among the documents was a list marked Emergency Access Cases. Miranda Chen's name was circled in red ink, followed by a note, Home care worker, single mom, needs long-term support, keep a close eye. Graham leaned back in his chair, stunned. Rose hadn't just known Miranda. She'd chosen her, believed in her, made her one of the few to receive indefinite assistance through access cards that didn't expire. Yet somewhere along the way that promise had been broken. He opened his email archive and searched for a Nourish program. The trail led straight to a memo dated 6 months after Rose's funeral, program deactivation approved, low ROI. Signed off by Lawrence Talbot, the CFO, with a footnote, reviewed by G. Whitaker. Graham closed his eyes, remembering that period. Grief, back-to-back meetings, signing whatever was necessary just to keep moving. He hadn't just failed to preserve his sister's legacy, he'd personally rubber-stamped its erasure. All the while, people like Miranda had been left to fend for themselves, still holding on to cards and promises that the company no longer honored. That realization felt heavier than any boardroom decision he'd ever made. This wasn't a spreadsheet problem, it was personal. Rose had built something beautiful for the invisible people, and Graham, blinded by grief and success, had let it decay in silence. But not anymore. He looked again at Miranda's name and whispered as if to Rose, "I'm sorry." Then he picked up the phone and said to his assistant, "I want every document related to the Nourish program, and I want it today." The night that pushed everything to the edge started like any other, bleach-scented floors, echoing footsteps, and a silence that clung to the walls. But just after 3 a.m., the routine broke. Graham, mopping near the back hallway, heard hurried footsteps and a muffled thud. He rounded the corner to find Miranda crouched over her nephew Max, who had collapsed on the floor near the staff lounge. His face was pale, his limbs trembling slightly, and Miranda looked panicked but controlled, cradling his head, whispering his name, gently patting his cheek. A night nurse rushed over, concern etched across her face, and within minutes a small crowd had gathered. "He's just tired," Miranda insisted, voice tight, eyes pleading. "He skipped dinner. He's been helping me with extra shifts at home." Her hands were shaking as she tried to explain. Doug Myers, the assistant supervisor, arrived moments later, already fuming. "This is a liability," he barked. "You can't have family here, and you certainly can't hide a sick kid in the lounge." Miranda stood, her eyes hardening despite the tremble in her chin. "I wasn't hiding him, he was waiting for me, quietly. We had nowhere else to go tonight." Doug wasn't moved. "You've crossed the line, first the food, now this. HR will hear about it in the morning." That's when Miranda broke. Her voice cracked, not with anger, but desperation. "I used to work here as a caregiver. I fed patients, bathed them, and read to them. When my sister died, I took in her kids. And when I couldn't make ends meet, I took the only job I could get, mopping the same floors I once walked with pride. And now, I'm a problem?" The hallway fell silent. Even Doug faltered, the air thick with discomfort. Graham stood just out of sight, frozen. He had heard passion before, but not like this, not the kind that comes from someone who has nothing left to protect but her children's dignity. Miranda looked down at Max, now awake and sitting up, and her eyes welled with tears. She whispered, "I'm not stealing, I'm surviving." It wasn't just a moment of truth, it was a moment that cracked something wide open inside Graham. The breaking point wasn't just Miranda's, it was his too. The next evening, the dining hall at Seaside Horizons bustled with its usual quiet rhythm. Soft clinking of silverware, low conversation, and the comforting scent of baked salmon and rosemary rolls. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Graham, no longer just Gary the janitor but still in disguise, stood off to the side, watching with narrowed eyes as Doug Myers approached the front of the hall with a familiar voucher clutched in his hand. At a table near the rear, Miranda sat with her son Eli and nephew Max, who had recovered enough to accompany her on her shift. Doug's voice, intentionally projected, cut through the calm. "Ms. Chen," he called out, holding up the faded voucher for all to see. "This expired card has been used repeatedly under false pretenses. You've also been seen removing food from staff areas against policy." Conversations around the room halted. Forks froze mid-air. Miranda stiffened, slowly rising from her seat, her cheeks flushed with shame, but her voice was calm. "That voucher was signed by Rose Whitaker herself. It was part of a promise your company made to struggling caregivers." Doug shook his head dismissively. "The program no longer exists, and you've been abusing what was left of it." Whispers spread among the residents. Several aides looked down, avoiding eye contact. Graham could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on everyone in the room. Then he stepped forward. "Actually," Graham said, shedding his pretense as the janitor and standing tall, "I'd like to clarify a few things." Every head turned. The room fell into stunned silence. Doug stared, eyes wide. "Mr. Whitaker?" he choked. Graham nodded and walked toward Miranda. "She didn't abuse the system," he said, voice steady. "We abused her trust. The voucher she used, it doesn't have an expiration date. My sister signed it herself for emergency support cases, and we failed to honor it." He turned to the diners and staff. "This facility was founded on dignity, but somewhere along the line, we started confusing efficiency with compassion. That ends tonight." He placed a gentle hand on Miranda's shoulder. "Ms. Chen isn't the problem. She's the reason we're still worth saving." A hush followed his words. Then, slowly, a round of quiet applause began. One by one, hands joined in. And in that moment, Graham didn't feel like a CEO reclaiming his reputation. He felt like a brother keeping a promise. Later that night, long after the dining hall had emptied and the whispers of stunned staff had faded into silence, Graham invited Miranda to his office, not the corporate high-rises, but the small corner room above seaside horizons that once belonged to Rose. The walls were still lined with old photographs from the program's early days, smiling caregivers, shared meals, and Rose's favorite quote framed above the desk. "Serve with dignity, or don't serve at all." Miranda entered cautiously, her posture stiff, bracing for reprimand. Instead, Graham gestured for her to sit and slid a manila envelope across the table. "This," he said gently, "is not a punishment, it's an offer." Inside was an official job proposal, Director of Caregiver Support and Community Outreach, a new position created to rebuild and lead the very program his sister had once designed. "I know this seems sudden," he added, "but you've already been doing the work. You've lived it." Miranda opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the details before lifting to meet him. "I'm a janitor," she said, voice low. "I don't have a degree. I don't know how to run a program." Graham smiled. "You've raised 3 kids on your own. You've kept a promise my company forgot. And you've done it with more grace than most people in corner offices." She blinked, overwhelmed. "This isn't charity?" "No," he replied. "This is trust, restored." He reached for a second envelope, this one containing a check made out to Willow Bridge Community Center, earmarked for housing assistance, with a note attached. "For the Chen family," meant to be delivered 6 years ago. Miranda pressed a hand to her mouth, struggling to speak. "Why now?" she whispered. Graham looked down at a photograph of Rose on the desk, then back to her. "Because I made a promise to someone I loved, and I broke it. But I think it's not too late to make it right." Miranda sat quietly for a moment, then slowly nodded. "If I'm going to do this," she said, "we do it the right way, from the ground up." Graham extended his hand. From the ground up? Their handshake wasn't just a new beginning, it was an act of repair. A second chance. For both of them. 6 weeks later, the sun dipped low over seaside horizons, casting a warm golden light across the newly renovated wing of the facility. Inside, the long-awaited launch of Rose's table was underway. The private dining space had been transformed into something entirely unique, part community kitchen, part shared sanctuary. There were no barriers between residents and guests, no velvet ropes or exclusive access, just one large table, polished and welcoming, surrounded by mismatched chairs chosen for comfort rather than uniformity. On one wall hung a framed photograph of Rose Whitaker, smiling beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "Everyone deserves a place at the table." Miranda, now dressed in a deep blue blazer with the new title Director of Caregiver Support embroidered in soft stitching above her pocket, moved between guests with a quiet confidence. Her children weren't just in attendance, they were part of the team. Eli helped an elderly resident carry her tray, Max assisted in restocking the fruit station, and Kayla coordinated volunteers from the local high school. The air buzzed with chatter and laughter, not the sterile calm of a care facility, but the genuine sound of people connecting over shared meals and second chances. Graham stood at the back for a moment, watching the scene unfold. There were reporters, local politicians, former critics, now turned supporters. But he didn't focus on them. He watched Miranda smile as she handed a slice of pie to a caregiver who'd just come off a 12-hour shift. He watched Tyler explain the story of Rose's table to a curious guest, and he watched residents light up as they were treated not as clients, but as part of something meaningful. When it was time, Graham stepped forward to speak. "This isn't just about food," he said, his voice steady. "It's about dignity, about repairing what we once neglected, and about continuing what Rose started. Tonight, we made good on a promise, not just to her, but to every family who thought they were forgotten." Applause broke out, but Graham's eyes were on Miranda, who wiped a quiet tear before nodding to him across the room. The grand opening wasn't just the launch of a program, it was the rebirth of a mission, stitched together with memory, community, and hope. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the buzz of celebration had softened into quiet, Graham wandered into the now empty Rose's table. The overhead lights were dimmed, casting a warm glow on the polished wood and the soft flicker of candlelight still lingering from the evening's event. He paused beside the framed photograph of Rose, studying her eyes, bright, determined, filled with a kind of optimism he'd nearly forgotten. Next to it, a child's drawing had been tacked to the corkboard, a crayon sketch of a long table filled with smiling faces. At the bottom, in blocky handwriting, it read, "Thank you for letting us eat here. Love, Eli." Graham felt a lump rise in his throat. He sat down at the table, no nameplate, no boardroom title, just a chair among many. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running a business. He felt like a brother honoring a promise, a man who had finally stopped looking away. Around him, the echoes of laughter and clinking plates seemed to linger in the air, as if Rose herself was somewhere close, watching, proud. The journey had not been easy. It required humility, hard questions, and uncomfortable truths. But it had also led to something more powerful than numbers on a ledger: redemption, both personal and public. Graham ran his fingers along the edge of the table and whispered to the empty room, "We didn't forget you, Rose. Not really. We just had to find our way back." Outside, the lights of seaside horizons glowed into the night like a beacon, and inside, Graham Whitaker sat quietly at the table his sister dreamed of. At last, not as the man who built the empire, but as someone who had finally come home. The story of Rose's table teaches a profound lesson about the power of humility, redemption, and the importance of keeping promises, especially the quiet ones made in the name of compassion. At its heart, it reminds us that true leadership isn't measured by titles or profit margins, but by the willingness to listen, to see the invisible struggles of others, and to act when it matters most. Graham Whitaker began as a man lost in grief and corporate detachment, but through the act of stepping down, literally and figuratively, he rediscovered the soul of his sister's mission. He learned that dignity can be restored, even after years of neglect, and that those we often overlook, like a janitor quietly feeding her family, carry the deepest strength. The lesson is clear. Legacy isn't about what we build, but what we uphold. And sometimes the most powerful way to honor the past is to recommit to the people and values we once took for granted. In a world often driven by speed and appearances, Rose's table stands as a symbol of what can happen when we slow down, pay attention, and offer a seat to those who were never meant to be forgotten.